To the Accidental Geographer. My name is Vincent Del Casino. I'm the Provost and Senior Vice President here at San Jose State University and the host of this podcast. On today's podcast, we're going to have a really interesting and exciting conversation with Dr. Sukanya and Theater here at San Jose State University. She has done some fantastic work at the intersection of theater and film and the way in which we think about identities in everyday life. So come on board. This is going to be a great conversation.
Thanks for being here. I really do appreciate it. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I always like to start, get a little sense of the journey kind of intellectually for you, but there's also obviously a geography to your travels, right? Having studied undergrad and master's degrees in India and then moving to a little known school up the road called Stanford, I think. Yeah. So what took you into the questions you've had, and why did you end up pursuing them the way you did? I'm just curious.
Yeah. So, as you said, I was born and raised in Kolkata, and I spent my entire life until my master's in Kolkata. I did my undergrad and master's in English literature, but I was always into storytelling, and I was really interested in embodied storytelling, which is why I was always interested in theater. I'm Bengali, and it's very common for Bengali households to just send children to singing classes, dance classes, theater classes. And so it was very part of the culture to practice theater. But at the same time, there was always this disconnect. It was always understood and assumed that that is a hobby and that is not something you pursue as a career, right? And so, I was always into storytelling. I thought, okay, maybe I have to do something with literature and stuff. But at the same time, I felt like I was kind of constantly being drawn by the potential of the stage. So at one point, I was actually working for a publishing house in Delhi after my master's, and it was an academic publishing house, and I was editing other academic books. And, this thought struck me that, life is short. If I had to do something, I have to do it now. And, I'm really passionate about theater, but how do I make it sustainable? Because it's not easy to, for artists to thrive, in the practical world. And so I was like, oh, but I'm also into higher studies. So maybe I'm going to pursue a PhD in theater. And that was just a thought. And then one thing led to another. And this was in 2007 when the recession had hit.
Right.
And I wasn't even sure if that plan was tenable. And, I started applying to UK schools first. And then I realized that they don't have much scholarship. And it was impossible for me to pursue a PhD without a scholarship. So I was like, okay, a friend who had gotten into a PhD program in the US, if you get accepted into a PhD program, they fund it fully. Oh, that's a good idea. I was like, okay, I'll start looking at, PhD programs in the US. And that's when I started applying. And all of a sudden, the world just opened up because, being in Kolkata all my life, we did have a lot of cultural expressions and a lot of theater. But again, we didn't have a separate theater department. We were doing theater in the English department, and it just didn't feel like it was well funded. Or, there is a National School of Drama in India, but that was very kind of Hindi language focused. And so all of a sudden, I'm thrilled to find these theater programs in the US, which are such vast, even the faculty were so exciting, right? The kinds of research that was going on.
Right.
And so I started applying, and then I had contacted Professor Jisha Menon from Stanford, and her research was quite in alignment with what I wanted to pursue. And she was like, yes, I urge you to apply. I'm like, oh, this is encouraging. I'm going to apply. And then I got into the program. I did it for the foreign package.
And Calcutta it's a really interesting city. And it shows the complexity of India. And image of it from the outside, what it is, because I've been there, what it is on the inside, versus Delhi, which has that. And so you focused your energy and your interests academically in that city as well, back to your background. So how did you start to think about what eventually would become your book, right? The In Between Worlds book, which is a great title, by the way, because it gives you that sense of what this is about. But kind of what motivated you in that? How does the city itself inform your thinking? Because I think there's a real intellectual link here between the city itself and the way you've been thinking about this work.
For sure. Again, being into embodied forms of storytelling, I've been very hyper aware of space. I think that really unites or kind of has this through line of connecting my different kinds of interests and works. And so when I was in Kolkata, again, I didn't look at the city from an outside perspective because I was immersed in it. I grew up in it and it was part of me. But when I left Kolkata, that is when it struck me how places shape you, and I had never paid attention to that until I left the place. And so, and of course, everything becomes so immersive in a space like, culture, language, music, theater, that all of that had become a part of me and my interests without me consciously trying to invite them, right? And then I leave, I come to the West Coast, which is in terms of miles, I don't even know how many miles, but also we have a time difference of 12 and a half hours. And, it's vast, right, in terms of geographical dislocation. But at the same time, I felt more connected to my roots in a strange way because it kind of made me think about the place and how it shapes you from my grad apartment in Stanford, right? And even the starkness of the differences and, the ways in which we try to build homes in places that are not homes, right? Kind of bring in objects or bring in music or bring, kind of simulate a sense of home in places that are not home, essentially. And that kind of led me to look at spaces, essentially. But also my book, as you mentioned, In Between Worlds, I've also been very fascinated with this idea of the liminal space.
Yeah.
I got introduced to that concept as a grad student here at Stanford, and I remember my mind literally blowing because I see how this is such a rich space. So you can do anything and everything, and and that is such a fundamental concept in performance. And that really informed my research, my outlook, my worldview. And I really see there is such great potential in being in that in-between space, because then we get a really good perspective of the spaces we inhabit or the spaces we depart from, spaces we go to.
Yeah, I think there's in the broad liberal arts, the social science and humanities, there's a spatial turn that happens in about the 90s going into the early 2000s. And that concept of liminality, of in-betweenness, of unclear where those borders are, and borders are so stark, and there was an attempt to do that. So when you unpack that in-betweenness, what are some of the indicators of that for you? How do you see that operating in context of your research? What does it mean, it look like?
Beautiful. Yes. So my research is very focused on this particular group of folk performers from Bengal. So in a way, it's very local, it's very localized in West Bengal and Bangladesh. But I am actually looking at the immense kind of potential that their performances bring in terms of nurturing a sense of in-betweenness in a political situation that is so fraught with this kind of us-them divide. I was beginning to think about their performances more from a very haptic sensibility. Again, I'm a very kind of touchy feely person, and I started thinking about the sensorial aspects of their songs,
Right.
how they create space through sound, and how they create locality through music, and through philosophy. And it's so rooted in the land. There are so many metaphors from Bengal, from the landscape of Bengal in the songs. And at the same time, they're so universal because they have a very spiritual context and content. And so I was very fascinated by this kind of grazing of the local and the global. And in this idea that, folk has been imagined as something that is in the past, right? Or has been romanticized, has been so I felt like I want to study this idea of the folk, which seems like a misfit in a world that is globalized and technologized. And then the more we studied, the more fascinated I became with the idea of folkness and how that is performed, and how spaces are created, manufactured, stimulated, in the context of tourism industry, right? Like, why do you kind of create folk, and how do you create folkness? And, what are the ways we are creating this kind of divide between tradition and modernity, especially in a world that is gradually getting globalized, this is what really fascinates me, that, on the one hand, there is this intense discourse on nationality, nationalism, borders, like us, them, and on the other hand, we're neoliberalism, trade, free trade, and of course, travel, everything has opened up. And at the same time, this kind of simultaneous need to protect boundaries, right? And I think they're cause effect relationality, but at the same time, that fascinates me, that how we kind of create borders, but also make them porous. And
yeah, well, I started in the intersection of tourism and geographies in Southeast Asia, and I've actually since gone back and written about that, very much around representational politics and the ways in which representation actually manifests itself in the real world, and actually, as opposed to the representation being the thing after, it is actually the thing before, and people start to see through it and the ways in which they imagine. But in that, which is really interesting, I want to pull out a little bit of conversation here, is that sense that the vernacular is an ephemera in general, or just these things that go on, but really they're informing and informed by all this stuff. So how does that play into your sense of understanding simulation, your paper in the urban geography, and I'm geeking out right now as a geographer, but this concept of the city of joy, what state choreography means. Get that Freudian slip. I said state cartography, state choreography, and how you're thinking about public space in Kolkata within the context of this simulation. So what was going on, and how are you thinking about that in this paper?
Sure. So, this paper evolved from a conversation we were having at Stanford. I was part of this working group called Creative Cities. While I was a grad student, and then even beyond that, I was part of that working group. And a lot of conversations emerged around public spaces and, the ways in which we see them, create them, choreograph them. And because I was coming from a performance studies background, I was really looking at the performance of spaces. So, I have been thinking a lot about, how spaces shape people who inhabit those spaces. But I was also thinking about how spaces perform, how spaces have character, have have costuming, or, have a certain essence, to them. And I was looking very closely at the city of Kolkata because I'm from there, and I've really thought about the spaces there. And then during the pandemic, everyone was, of course, thinking about how, this, all of a sudden, we're now restricted to this one role, or on Zoom. And, and then space becomes a very rich conversation again. And so a bunch of us who were part of that working group started thinking about the ways in which the pandemic has affected the performance of space.
Right.
And public spaces, especially in the context of pandemic, where, there are so many rules and regulations on what the public space now entails, or like who can inhabit the public space, and that really led me to this kind of urban geography paper where I was again looking at it through the lens of Sorkin's idea of like desertification and like, homogenization of a space and a city. And I was looking at how the state choreography, or the ways in which the state wants to represent urban spaces, can gloss over certain particularities that might reveal something that does not conform to the performance that has been preset, right?
Right.
Yeah. So we have kind of learned to kind of really probe into what are those particularities and where have we glossed over, and what is the history of kind of glossing over, and especially with Kolkata being this really interesting city which was built by the British, right? And it was just 3 villages at one point, and then the British come and then they actually create the city, which is why it's even more interesting to me that in a post-colonial context, when we are trying to decolonize, from Calcutta to Kolkata, but at the same time, like the chief minister of West Bengal had made a comment that I want to turn Kolkata into London, with a very optimistic kind of outlook. And that was like such an interesting statement to me. And that again led me to kind of look at these perceptions we have of the first world, the developing world, like, who simulates whom, and, in whose image, and who performs, who choreographs. And
Kolkata it's a pretty politically intense city.
For sure.
When I got there, I was, there's an image that one has, but then when you're in, I went to some of the archives, we really dug in. I was actually there as part of an academic enterprise of, thinking through space and how we teach geography and history in K-12, actually. And we had a bunch of teachers who were going, but its history is rich with political dissent, right? I imagine that's coming up in the performances, right? Where these different identities, which, were, as you point out, like 3 villages become a city. There's an intentionality of urbanizing communities, right? So it must be just so rich for that sort of questions and the intensity of, I guess.
Yes,
fastness.
Absolutely. I mean, again, politics has been so kind of imbued in the fabric of the city. Like, and again, like I said, like if you're in the city, you don't realize it as something odd or like something different until you leave. Like, oh, it's very particular to Kolkata that we see like, so many slogans, and it's very politically charged, and communism being a big part of the fabric of the city, and
right.
We grew up in a communist government, and so it's very interesting to me the ways in which even the culture has evolved and shifted through the 80s and 90s.
Yeah. Well, and as you said, getting to even just Delhi, it gives you like this different view of that. So obviously you still have a passion of being an artist as well, like, and performing. And you most recently, you just put something together, and tell me how that continues to inform your kind of academic trajectory, but how you think about your world as an artist and why you keep your foot in that sort of world. And
I think evolving as an artist and a scholar, I feel like a lot of my questions are kind of around the idea of post-colonialism and how coloniality has shaped us. And, I also look at colonialism spatially in a lot of ways because, the architecture left behind by the British in, juxtaposition with the newer architecture that is informed by global influences. And so it kind of really makes me think about space, but also what it does to subjecthood, right? Like, I grew up speaking two languages. I grew up speaking Bangla mostly, but in my school, English was the medium of instruction. And so I always felt this kind of shape-shifting, like, duality, or like, I feel like I dream in Bangla, but I'm literally, like, when I used to be in Kolkata, I think my relationship with English was more like functional. Like, it was more like a language that I would use to convey something official or like something professional. Whereas like Bangla was the language of emotions and dreams and poetry and literature. And I always felt that kind of duality in me. Like, if I were to have a very serious argument, I would switch to English. But like, if I were to like write poetry, I would write manga. So this kind of like influence of colonialism has been also a very embodied experience for me.
Right.
And then I got this opportunity to work on this production, which was like so close to my heart for all the reasons that you talked about. It's called Public Obscenities, and it premiered in Soho Rep in New York and off-Broadway production last year in January. And then it was just so life-changing for me, because in my mind, I had never imagined witnessing actors speaking Bangla on a mainstream American stage.
Right.
And being received so well by the general audience members, right? It was like a dream. It was never something that I thought was possible, simply because of like the ways in which I kind of compartmentalized my psyche, my life. And then this happened, and it made me realize that, there is like such universality in particularity. Like, it was so specifically set in Kolkata, the play Public Obscenities. The director and playwright is also a Stanford graduate. Our paths had briefly crossed at Stanford, but he graduated before me. And then we started talking about this project. It came as part of a fellowship program and it's part of, and then we started talking about how intentionally we create space that actually gives people the experience of being in a typical Bengali drawing room in Kolkata. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at the set pictures, but if you do, you will have a sense of what a typical Bengali drawing room looks like. And it was such a deliberate kind of, again, like designing of the story is set in Kolkata. The premise is that an anthropologist and a researcher, a Bengali American, goes back to Kolkata with his Black boyfriend and goes back to his ancestral house, kind of like aunt's house, and then it's more like kind of investigating the nature of desire, the nuances of, what desire means in a queer context, but also in a post-colonial context. And the title is actually taken from, the penal code that was kind of inherited from the British,
right,
which defined obscenity. And, and it kind of makes us question, what are these different ideas that have been left behind by the British administration, and, how that has shaped us in terms of how we are in the world, what desire means, what obscenity means, what queerness means. But it all happens in that kind of space where there is a dining table, there's a little kind of bed, there's a fridge, there's a fan, there's an AC, but all the set pieces are functional. So, I mean, the idea was to make it as naturalistic as possible, like hyper naturalistic, and getting into like the nitty gritty is like really the specifics. Like, a typical dining table would have homeopathy box, or like digestive medicines, or like, something so specific to the culture and the cultural fabric of Kolkata. And that was such an interesting project for me, because I felt like even the playwright and the director, Chayak Chaudhary, was very unapologetic about the use of specificity in terms of space,
Right.
but also in terms of language.
Right.
And there were certain scenes that were deliberately and consciously left untranslated. Like, we did have super titles in most of the scenes, but also the idea was to kind of experience language and culture through our bodies, and a lot of that experience is very common to immigrants in this country, right? Like, so many immigrants come to this country without knowing English, but they kind of, experience it through the body, and we were kind of switching that over a little bit, and like having actors speak in Bangla, and having like a whole broad audience, from all over. Demographic was pretty big, and and just seeing how how that has affected different people differently, right? Like, different people come into that space with different experiences, different emotions, and
When I went to see Kite Runner, and there was an Afghani community in the road, and Afghan was spoken. It was very interesting to watch those reactions, because obviously you're going to engage that language differently. But it was such a wonderful way to learn too, because I imagine there were probably Bengali audience members who were like, "Oh, I know exactly what's going on right now," and that discomfort is actually helpful. I think of like, I shouldn't know every single thing, but I can learn from that experience, and that's a really powerful way to get people to get outside themselves. Because I do remember the first time I studied abroad, just like you, that's when you really realize what it's like to grow up in the United States. You go somewhere else, and you realize people have a perception of what that is, all of that, and you're having to comport yourself in a very different way, and it challenges you. So that's really awesome. How does that all play into your teaching here, and how do you think about engaging students and thinking about how you bring your art and your intellectual work into the classroom,
Yeah, thank you for that question. I have always identified as a teacher of sorts. I mean, I make it sound more poetic, and I think of myself as a prism, and but also my mother was a teacher, and somehow I kind of feel like I always wanted to be a teacher and an artist and a scholar. So, I had to kind of combine all of that. But growing up, like I mentioned earlier, that theater was never an option for me as a career of sorts, but also the kinds of theater we were studying as part of our English curriculum were all very Eurocentric. Right. And, to me, it felt like theater only means Ibsen, Pinter, Beckett, and, and so I felt like, maybe I don't know why I'm drawn to this art, but, it seems like great theater is only composed of white men.
Right.
And then I come here to do my PhD, and then all of a sudden I feel like my world opens up, and I have to say, like, one of the teachers I encountered at Stanford really changed my perspective on life, and she really inspired me to think of myself as a teacher, scholar, artist, and her name is Shay Marapon. She's now in UC Santa Barbara, but before that, she was an artist in residence at Stanford. She taught playwriting classes, and she was very active in the 60s and 70s, the Hispanic cultural kind of revolution movement. And she made me realize that the more focused you are in your kind of ethnic background, in your truth, the more universal even is. And so when I started thinking about teaching, I was like, oh, I have to now teach like Beckett Pinter. But then I realized that, theater is so much more than that, right? Like theater has that lineage, of course, like we kind of think about theater pedagogy through a very Western lens in regular life, but we are gradually departing from that Eurocentric lens and we are opening up. And so my interest is now in contemporary theater and in kind of multicultural, global theater where we can include several voices. And being at Sun was a state that just allows me the freedom to explore that wide gamut of what theater may or may not be and what we want theater to be, right? Like we don't have to fit into a mold that theater has been defined as, but we can redefine theater, we can expand on it. And, the students that we have are so diverse and, come from all sorts of backgrounds, all sorts of languages, linguistic backgrounds, algebra. And, it just makes me so happy to see each of them contributing to the storytelling experience and bringing in cultural influence. So right now, a part of my kind of mission as an educator is also to kind of decolonize curriculum. Like I have been really engaged in kind of looking at theater history from a broad global perspective and not just focus on Eurocentric perspective so that, we don't just grow up believing Greeks were the only people who did theater or theater originated from the Greeks. It's such a misconception. And so I really am dedicated to the idea of expanding theater in the classroom. And so I teach theater history, but I teach theater history from a global perspective. And I love that, students really get exposed. I mean, a lot of us, including me, didn't realize that, it's not true. Theater did not originate from the Greek. I mean, there was theater, in other parts of the world.
Storytelling is essential to the human condition.
Exactly. So I kind of made these little tiny changes in the syllabus, in the ways in which I kind of design my PowerPoint. The more students see women of color, BIPOC, queer artists, even in terms of visibility, it changes their perception of what theater can or cannot be, right? It just opens up the space more and makes things into a side.
Well, I think, there's been a big shift in the higher education, in my opinion, to not only recognize that students come with their own stories, but that it's actually essential for them to start to see themselves in their learning, their education, because it creates a sense of belonging community that otherwise you could remain pretty distant from the material. So I think what you're doing is a brilliant contribution to what is a really important way for us to think about the future of higher education. And it needs to be everywhere. It's not just in theater. It's got to be in the sciences and the engineering. We have to find ways for students to start to share those experiences. And I love the way you point out how particularity has a sort of universal quality to it. It's a really profound moment. I hadn't thought of it that way, but that the people could see themselves. That's not my particularity, but I have a particularity. And there's some resonance and there's some difference, but it's valued. And I think that's what becomes critical.
Exactly. And I also think that just letting students feel like they are seen is just such a profound experience. I've had students come up to me and say that I had never thought that there is Hispanic theater, for example. I'd never thought there is Indian theater, and that can be done in America. And, because of the ways in which we have been trained to think, and now just, allowing ourselves to open up and reimagine and rethink the landscape of theater has been very fulfilling. Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, I want to thank you so much for taking the time. This has been an absolutely incredible conversation, and I really appreciate it. I've learned so much just in the short period of time. I imagine we can dig in for much longer. So
thank you so much, Vin. It was so wonderful and very enriching. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Oh.